This is a lecture on America's Gilded Age, which takes place roughly from 1870 to 1890. These are the learning outcomes for this lecture and chapter. First, we want to identify what factors combined to make the United States a mature industrial society after the Civil War. We will explore how the West transformed economically and socially in the Gilded Age. We will examine if the Gilded Age political system was effective in meeting its goals. We will analyze how economic development of the Gilded Age affected American freedom. And finally, we'll identify how reformers in the Gilded Age approached the problems of an industrial society. So this chapter begins talking about the Statue of Liberty. The Statue of Liberty was dedicated to the United States from France, specifically from Eduardo de la Boulaye. And this was given as a response to the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. And then and now, the Statue of Liberty has really become a symbol of freedom. It's often used to denote this concept of freedom. Of course, what exactly freedom means is very ill-defined. But inscribed on the base of the Statue of Liberty is a poem by Emma Lazarus, and part of which reads, "Here at our sea-washed sunset gates shall stand a mighty woman with a torch whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name Mother of Exiles." So this tells you how America was billing itself as this place of exiles, of this place of immigrants, of accepting the people that the rest of the world didn't want and turning them into something great. And so at least in 1903, that was America's vision of itself, at least in its idealized form. So even though we have this kind of concept of freedom and liberty, and the question is, and something to think about not just in this lecture but in all future lectures, is what are the social conditions that make freedom possible? And what role should the national government play in defining and protecting the liberty of its citizens? Because being free means different things to different people at different times. So what is it that makes you free? Number one. And number two, what role does the government have in ensuring that freedom? And these are things that change over time and are highly contested even to this day. So on the top of the slide, you can see the learning outcome that we're currently working on for that slide. So right now we're working on identifying what factors combined to make the United States a mature industrial society after the Civil War. So the American economy is going to grow rather exponentially after the Civil War, and there's several reasons for this growth. One reason is that America was blessed with abundant natural resources. Part of it is because of our size, part of it's just luck, but everything from coal to oil to ores, there's ample farmland. So America was blessed with having everything it needed to grow here. A second cause for growth was the growing labor supply. Americans' natural increase was positive. There was a positive birth rate during this time period. But more than that was that there was exponential immigration to the United States during this time period. Millions and millions of mostly Southern and Eastern Europeans are going to be pouring into the United States during this time. A third cause for growth was the expanding market for manufactured goods. You're not going to make something if you have nobody to sell it to. But as more and more people came in, as more and more people became tied to the national and in some cases international economy, that meant there was markets to sell manufactured goods to, and so people made more. A fourth cause was the availability of capital for investment. So if you want to build a factory, if you want to start a farm, if you want to start a business, you need financing to start that. So you need a loan, you need to have investors. And that was available in the United States. After the Civil War, the banking industry largely modernized. And so this is going to be things that are going to help the United States do that. And finally, something that oftentimes gets overlooked, you had a lot of government support for growth. This did not just happen. This happened as a result of governmental policies and government aid. And so keep this in mind whenever you hear anybody talk about government handouts. Government hands out a lot to business. And whether that's a good thing or a bad thing is not kind of the point. The point is that it happens. And sometimes especially in modern day political rhetoric, we pretend like it doesn't, right? But you do have high government support, government policies supporting industrial expansion. One government support was high tariffs. So a tariff is a tax on imported goods. And you have a tariff for kind of two main reasons. There's others, but two main reasons. The first, of course, is to make money. And the tariff is going to be one of the main ways that the United States government gets money during this time period because there's no income tax yet. So the first is to make money. But the second reason you have a tariff is to make home goods artificially competitive, right? So, for example, say there was two pencils. One pencil was manufactured in the United States and it cost $1, and one pencil was manufactured in Mexico and it cost 50 cents. Now, it costs 50 cents in Mexico for various reasons, right? They don't have to pay their people much. There's, less regulations. Lumber was cheaper, whatever the reason. So, me as a consumer, when I go to buy my pencil, assuming that the quality is more or less equivalent, I'm going to pick the 50-cent one in most cases because that's better for my bottom line. Well, that hurts American pencil manufacturers. They can't compete with, Mexican wages. So what do? We slap a tariff on Mexican pencil imports. And so we say, okay, any pencil that comes in from Mexico, there's going to be $1 tariff. Well, of course, the company doesn't pay that. They pass that on to consumers. And so now when I go to buy my pencil, there's an American pencil for $1, and here's a Mexican pencil for $1.50. I'm going to pick the American pencil. So in general, tariffs are very good for businesses. Businesses like tariffs. It helps business, right? It hurts, number one, consumers. Consumers have to pay more money for goods and services. So tariffs are bad for consumers, good for businesses. The second group that tariffs hurt indirectly is agriculture. It's very bad for agriculture. And the reason why is that this is just the way it works, right? If you put a tariff on a country, they will immediately turn around and put a tariff on you. It's just how the world works, right? If you do it to me, I'm going to do it to you. And one of America's biggest exports is food. And so when you put these tariffs on these manufactured goods, it helps business. But farmers who are trying to sell their goods overseas are now going to be faced with tariffs on their goods, and they're not going to be able to sell their goods as much. So tariffs in general help manufacturing and hurt farmers. So during this time period, back to the causes for growth, one of the main causes for growth is government support in the form of high tariffs. A second form of government support that we see is the government actively helping railroads. Now, railroads we'll talk more about a little bit later. These are massive companies. These are gajillionaires who own them. And so you would think they should be able to take care of this themselves, but the government is going to be, in many cases, actively assisting them. And we'll see this primarily in the form of land grants. Almost all the land that the railroads get is going to be given to them either by the national or state governments. And then finally, a third form of government support is the use of the army to remove Native Americans from their ancestral lands in the West. And so this is going to allow for the West to be, settled, I guess, is for lack of a better word. So keep this in mind that a lot of the land that's owned in the West was forcibly seized by somebody else at the point of a gun. All this is going to combine so that by 1913, the United States is going to produce 1/3 of the world's industrial output, which is just amazing growth and amazing economic powerhouse. And it also importantly is going to signal the transition from a small farm and artisan workshop economy to a mature industrial society. Prior to this time period, most Americans lived on farms. The manufacturing that was done in a small shop with a master and his apprentices. That changes here. Now America is going to become an industrialized society where the small farms are under attack, the master shop thing has disappeared, we're in factories now. And by 1880, the census is going to show that for the first time, the majority of the American workforce was engaged in non-farming jobs. What that means then is that a new working class had emerged. And so this is very much a transition away from Lincoln's America, the America that existed before the Civil War, into something new. And one symptom of this is going to be the growth of cities. There were cities, of course, before this, but they tended to be fewer and smaller. That all changes here. Cities become more numerous, they become bigger. This is not the cause of the industrial economy, it is a symptom of the industrial economy. And they become vital for financing this industrialization. Think of it as a snake eating its tail, right? Cities allow for more industrialization. America becomes more industrialized because there's more cities. And one of the biggest areas where we see this growth is in the Great Lakes region. Places like Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin. And this is where most of the manufacturing in the, quote, second industrial revolution is going to take place. So before I change slides, if you need to pause this recording to catch up on anything you missed, please do so now. So one of the main drivers of this new industrialized economy during this time period are going to be the railroads. And some historians claim that it's going to be the railroad that makes the second industrial revolution possible. One reason for this is that railroads are going to be what creates a national market. So before the invention of railroads, there were only two ways to get your goods to market. The first, of course, was to walk with your horse. If you're living in the middle of nowhere, that is absolutely not cost effective. Think if you had to walk from Laredo to San Antonio to sell some potatoes. Think of all the money you would need to spend to buy supplies, a horse, a wagon, food, water, protection to make that several-day walk to San Antonio. You would spend more money walking to the market to sell your goods than you could ever sell your potatoes for. And so people didn't do it in most cases. There's some glorious exceptions to this, right? The South, for example, was always engaged in a national or international market with cotton, for example. But for most people, unless you lived on a waterway in which it was possible to sell your goods to a larger market, people didn't. It was too expensive, it was too costly. And so prior to the railroads, there really wasn't much of a national market to speak of. That changes with the railroad because now you can just walk to the railroad stop, load your potatoes onto the train, and off it goes. You can sell your potatoes if you live in Texas in New York City now. And so it's going to be the railroads which ties the whole economy together and allows for a national market to emerge. Interestingly, it's also because of the railroads that we have time zones. The Eastern Standard Time, Central Standard Time, Mountain Standard Time, Pacific Standard Time. And it was because they needed to standardize time to make the trains literally run on time. So as kind of an aside. So what this growing population formed in the United States then is going to be this kind of ever-expanding market for mass production, mass distribution, and the mass marketing of goods. And remember, a lot of the land that the railroads tycoons have, and remember, these are owned by private individuals, they're gajillionaires. Again, much of this is going to be coming from the federal government. So, really, the railroad magnates receive one of the biggest government handouts in all of history. Another thing that's helping along our industrial economy is major innovations during this time period. There are major scientific breakthroughs and technological innovations that are going to be spurring growth, especially in the areas of communication and transportation. And probably the most important American inventor that you need to be aware of is Thomas Edison, who it feels like invented everything, right? He invented the phonograph, the light bulb, the motion picture, and even a system for generating and distributing electrical power. And attached to that is going to be the spread of electricity. Now, electricity has been around since before the Civil War, but increasingly in the Gilded Age, more and more companies and individuals are getting access to electricity. So it is spreading during this time period to everything from factories to private homes. It's becoming more and more common, particularly in cities. And all of this is going to be essential to industrial and urban growth. Businesses during this time period are going to be almost completely unregulated. So this is the wild west of business. This is as close to laissez-faire capitalism as the United States is ever going to get. And that helps to explain why in many ways business was so very abusive during this time period, but also why it's so very unstable as well. So you do have a series of depressions that are going to plague the economy between 1873 and 1897. Oftentimes in 19th century language, you'll see those called panics. So the Panic of 1873, for example, just means the Depression of 1873. So that's kind of symptomatic of the kind of growth we're talking about, because there is going to be enormous economic growth during this time period, but it's going to be very, very unstable. And so think of it as a roller coaster. People would get very, 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 very rich fast, and then just as quickly with the snap of fingers it would come crashing down, right? And you see this in the economy as a whole. So to try to kind of deal with some of this competition, which was really cutthroat and dramatic during this time period, businesses tried different things. One thing they tried was pools. Pools would divide up markets and fix prices. Today this is illegal, right? But they would say things like, okay, Company X is only going to operate in Texas. Company Y is going to operate in Oklahoma, Kansas, and Nebraska. Company Z is going to operate in California, and we're not going to go into each other's markets, and we're going to charge $10 for our product, right? That kind of thing. Another thing they tried were trusts. Trusts were legal devices where the affairs of several rival companies would be managed by a single director. In many ways, this would be creating a monopoly, right? And what this did was it hurt consumers, because consumers would end up having, number one, no other option, and number two, having to pay higher prices. And of course, the directors of these trusts were very, very, very powerful people. So we're going to see kind of major cutthroat competition, and more corporations are going to battle to control entire industries. And so we do have monopolies during this time period. This is before the government sought to prevent monopolies, and in many ways why the government today seeks to prevent monopolies. And part of this is going to be helped along by a very powerful financier named J.P. Morgan. So J.P. Morgan is going to be kind of the money behind it, and he's going to help create some of the major conglomerates during this time period, such as U.S. Steel, Standard Oil, International Harvester. And so what we'll see is more and more corporate consolidation, so much so that between 1897 and 1904, over 4,000 firms will vanish and be swallowed up by larger corporations. So at this point, if you need to pause this recording to catch up on anything, please do so now. So who are these gajillionaires that are controlling these major industries? And there are a lot of them during this time period. One way to think of it is, are they a captain of industry or a robber baron, right? And I guess it depends on whether or not we're mad at them. The story that all of these guys would have told you was that they started from nothing. They, through hard work and individualism, they pulled themselves up by their bootstraps and achieved the American dream, and nobody helped them. They did it all by themselves. And that, to a T, is going to be the narrative that almost all of them are going to be making. In reality, though, that's largely not true. You do have a few examples of this kind of rags to riches story. I mean, it did happen, but it was really weird, right? Most of these robber barons are already going to be coming from wealth and power, and they just get more of it. You do have a few examples. Carnegie's a good example. Rockefeller's a good example of these rags to riches story. But again, they're exceptional. It was very, very, very unlikely in the Gilded Age that you would become a gajillionaire, right? Just like today, there are examples of people who start from nothing and become very, very rich. Think Bill Gates, think Mark Zuckerberg. But they're weird, right? This is not your average experience. And so it was in the Gilded Age. So keep in mind, too, that during this time period, there is no such thing as a personal income tax. There's no such thing as a corporate income tax. And if we agree that money in many respects equals power, these people are going to be extremely powerful, oftentimes even more powerful in some ways than, congressmen or senators or even the president in some instances. So this is as close to oligarchy as America got. This is as close to laissez-faire capitalism as America ever gets. So Andrew Carnegie is our first example of a robber baron. He is a good example of that rags to riches story. Andrew Carnegie himself was an immigrant from Scotland. His father was originally a weaver and was displaced by technology. The family fell on hard times and they immigrated to the United States. And Carnegie, worked himself up to owning a company called U.S. Steel in the 1870s. And U.S. Steel was going to dominate the steel industry, and it was located in, its main shop was located in Homestead, Pennsylvania, but he had steel companies all over the place. And one of the ways that he became super rich was by practicing something called vertical integration. Vertical integration is when a company controls all elements of production. So, for example, if I made cars, say I needed rubber for the tires, steel for the body, glass for the windows. So I would go to a rubber plant and buy rubber. I would go to a steel plant and buy steel. I would go to, the glass factory and buy glass. If I'm practicing vertical integration, I myself would own my own rubber company. I would own my own steel company. I would own my own glass company, and I would only use my own product so that every step along the line I'm making money. So he was a master at that. He owned everything from the mines to manufacture the ore, the rail lines to ship it on, the plants to process it, the distribution points to distribute it. And this is how he became very, very rich. Now, he viewed himself as kind of this paternalistic, guy who was helping out the lower classes, kind of grandfatherly, and really did believe that, workers should be grateful to him for giving them a job. And he did believe in giving back to society, but he did run his company with a dictatorial hand. He was extremely anti-union. He fought all union efforts violently in some cases. He did not believe workers should have a right, and he does pay his workers very poorly. So this process of becoming super rich was not gentle, right? He did it on the backs of his workers, who he paid poorly and treated fairly poorly. Now, one thing he did is eventually he talks about philanthropy, and he writes a work called The Gospel of Wealth, or Wealth for short. And in this, he argued that the super wealthy have a responsibility to society, right? So first, he doesn't apologize for inequality. In fact, he embraces it. He says it's good to be have economic inequality because, well, without it, how could some of us be, do art, or become philosophers or thinkers, or kind of enlightened above everybody's humans, right? So he's embracing it, and not surprising, because he gets to be one of those people that gets to sit around and think while the rest of us work in a coal mine, right? But he says, okay, if you are one of these lucky people that is super rich, you do have an obligation to give back to society. But he's being very careful about what he means by that. He doesn't mean what he considered to be handouts, right? And this ties into social Darwinism, which we'll talk more about a little bit later. But this idea that if you just give somebody food, then they're just going to be lazy and never work, right? Instead, he's going to be doing things like building libraries so that you can go and educate yourself if you're really one of these people that deserves to succeed. We'll talk later about whether or not this is really realistic, but this is where he was coming from. Another example of a robber baron is John D. Rockefeller. Rockefeller is going to dominate the oil industry, at one point controlling 98% of the oil industry. And his company was called Standard Oil. And he was a master of horizontal integration, or expansion, as your book calls it. And this is when you own all like industries, so creating a monopoly. So Rockefeller was extremely cutthroat, and he basically either drove his competition out of business or he swallowed them up. And he would do things like, sabotage or bribe legislatures or undercut the competition, everything he could do to destroy any competition he had. And he was very good at it. He is going to, control 98% of the oil industry. He also is going to be extremely anti-union. He's also going to pay his people poorly. So you'll see kind of this theme here. And so, again, that brings us back to, are these guys kind of heroes that they built these industries, became super powerful, built these companies into mega conglomerate global companies? Or are they robber barons? Did they do this on the backs of poor people? Did they do it by taking advantage of others and breaking the rules that everybody else has to follow? Again, I guess it depends on whether or not we're mad at them for this or not. So at this point, if you need to pause the video to catch up on something, please do so now. Economic growth in the Gilded Age was enormous. The economy explodes. Certain people get incredibly rich, so rich that their ancestors are still super rich today. But you need to understand that economic growth was unevenly distributed. Not everybody benefits. Only a very small group benefits. So for a minority of workers, the rapidly expanding industrial system does create new forms of freedom. Some workers, particularly skilled workers, will get higher wages. Some workers, particularly skilled workers, will have control over production. And what I mean by that is, do you get to control your day, right? Some workers have to stand on the assembly line. They have to clock in exactly at 8 o'clock. They have to clock out at exactly 10 o'clock. They have to do things a certain way at a certain pace, right? That's very bad for workers. Some workers didn't have to go through that, particularly if they were skilled. They could control their own production. And so now economic independence is going to shift. Prior to this time period, economic independence meant you owned your own shop. You became a master artisan. So you were a master carpenter and you owned your own carpentry shop. Or you became a master, carriage maker, and you owned your own carriage shop. That's what economic independence meant prior to this time period. But now it's shifting to technical skills. Do you have technical skills that are marketable and are transferable? And that in many ways is what led to economic independence during this time period, as opposed to owning a specific shop, because again, small shops are under increasing pressure during this time period. um, and the main way that this minority of workers is going to benefit is through unions. Unions are going to be almost the only vehicle that allows for fair wages, that allows for good treatment. Um, the biggest con that companies ever did was convince your average worker that unions are bad. If you look at any chart that shows wages with union membership, they are going to line up, right? High union membership means high wages, and the reverse is also true. So there is a minority of workers that benefit. Most, however, do not. For most workers in the Gilded Age, economic insecurity is going to remain a basic fact of life. And during economic depressions, especially, the quote, tramp was very common. This would be somebody who was homeless, who owned nothing, and would just kind of travel from town to town, city to city, looking for work. So, even if you did have a job during this time period, wages are going to be incredibly low. So low, in fact, that all members of the family, including young children, have to work in order for the family to survive. And even then, it still may not be enough. This is also a very dangerous time to be a worker. Because again, remember, there are no regulations. This is unregulated capitalism, so they don't have to pay you a living wage, and they don't have to provide you a safe working environment. So, for example, between 1880 and 1900, an average of 35,000 workers died each year in factory and mine accidents, and this was the highest rate in the industrialized world. And that was fine. If you died at work, nothing was going to happen to your employer. If you got hurt at work, your employer was not obligated to help you. They did not have to pay you wages. They did not have to pay for a doctor. That was just too bad. In fact, you'd probably be fired if you got hurt seriously. So this is a time, too, when class divisions are going to become more and more visible. And the class divisions are going to be very stark. By 1890, the richest 1% received the same total income as the bottom half of the population, right? So 1% of the population had as much income as the other, as 50% of the country, which is pretty stark. And this division was very, very visible because many of the wealthiest Americans consciously pursued an aristocratic lifestyle. They weren't just rich, they were flaunting how rich they were. And you see an important study on this in Thorstein Veblen's The Theory of the Leisure Class, where he talks about this conspicuous consumption. And by conspicuous consumption, we mean spending money simply to demonstrate the possession of wealth, right? So things like having that, if you've seen the movie The Great Gatsby or read the book The Great Gatsby, that's this. The idea of having a swimming pool full of champagne because you can, right? Of having a different hat for every day of the year because you can. This kind of thing. And the only reason why you would do this is because you're doing it to show to all the people around you, hey, look how rich I am. You contrast this with the kind of desperate living conditions of the poor, and that was documented really well by a photographer named Jacob Riis in the work How the Other Half Lives, and you'll see pictures of this kind of all throughout this presentation in 1890. But he went into the sweatshops, he went into the boarding houses, and he wrote about these people's lives. And when you contrast what your average person's living conditions were with what this 1%'s living class's conditions were, it was really, really stark. If you need to pause the video to catch up on something, please do so now. Moving on to the West, we're going to explore how the West transformed economically and socially in the Gilded Age. The biggest thing you need to realize is that America's conquest of the West is part of a larger pattern, right? This is going to be a global process that's going on. Many countries during this time period are doing this. And this is partly because of the rise of this concept of the nation state and territory. And not to go too much into this, but we tend to think of countries as always existing, as having very firm borders, of people identifying with their country as a country being a quote thing, right? A thing that exists, independent of anything. And in reality, that's a very, very, very modern concept. That is something that is emerging during this time period. So this idea of a country existing independent of its own, of people belonging to a country, that's very new, and that's what's happening during this time period. So this is part of this larger kind of global process. Now, the West, of course, was not empty. Prior to the Civil War, most of the area beyond the Mississippi River was controlled by over 250,000 Native Americans. That land was under the control of Native Americans, and Native Americans relied mostly on the buffalo in the West. The buffalo was the main thing that many of them relied on. Not all of them, but a lot of them. So prior to the Civil War, the federal government, not that they didn't want that land, but didn't have the power or the resources to kind of take it from the people who controlled it. That changes after the Civil War. And so the federal government will begin acquiring Indian land both by war and through treaties. And once they get that land, they will be administering it. They will be selling this land for money. They'll be distributing this land to white farmers. They'll be giving the land out to railroads. They'll be giving it out to mining companies. And you see it through various things, right? One thing that gets passed right during the Civil War is the Morrill Land Grant Act, which is going to give land to establish public universities in the West. And you're going to see the federal government really taking an active role in settling the West. It could not be done without the federal government's active assistance because, number one, you have to take it from somebody else. And then number two, you have to create markets, create governments, create security, create bureaucracy in order to turn this land into states. Keep in mind that the Western territories will take much longer than Eastern territories to achieve statehood. Places like Arizona, Idaho, Montana, the Dakotas. And partly this is because there were anxieties about the types of people that lived in these places. They were worried, for example, about high levels of Latino populations. They were worried about Mormon populations. They were worried about Native American populations. So that's part of the reason why that happens. But you are going to see a lot of federal assistance given to the West, and that runs up against this myth of rugged individualism. This idea of rugged individualism is what we talked about before, this idea of I did it all by myself. Nobody helped me. I pulled myself up by my bootstraps and did it all on my own. I don't need anybody's help. If you take help, you're weak. And that's a very American thing. This myth of rugged individualism has seeped its way into American culture, even to the present day. If you were to say, my parents didn't help me pay for college at all, I paid for it all by myself, in America, people would be like, wow, well done, good, right? In another country like Japan, people would have said, you poor thing, what was wrong with your parents? So this is a very American thing, and it stems from, this life on the frontier, because at least early on, right, when there was limited government support, you did have to be fairly self-reliant. That being said, when you look at it holistically, this idea of rugged individualism was a myth because the federal government was very, very active in assisting the formation of the West, the settlement of the West. The federal government paid for irrigation for farmers. It paid for the construction of dams. It gave aid to large-scale commercial farming. Um, it conquered the land and took it from the Indians. So again, this idea of rugged individualism is largely a myth. That is not to say that individual farmers living on little helps on the prairie didn't have to work very, very hard and didn't have to have some level of self-reliance. They did, but none of that would have been possible without this very active and expensive and intense support from the government. So if you need to pause the recording to catch up on something, please do so now. Most of the settlers that move into the Trans-Mississippi West are going to be farmers. And more land will come into cultivation during the 30 years after the Civil War than the previous 2.5 centuries of American history, thanks in part to the Homestead Act. What the Homestead Act did was it granted 160 acres free to any settler who would live and work the land for 5 years. And on the one hand, the goal of the Homestead Act was to settle the West with small yeoman farmers. This was the goal. And largely, if that's the goal, it's largely going to be a failure, because most of this land is actually going to end up in the hands of agribusiness. Most farmers that got out there are not going to be able to make it. So despite its intentions, it's not going to succeed in settling it with small independent farmers. Most of this land ends up in the hand of speculators or to giant agribusiness. But it does get the ball rolling, and thanks to that, we're going to see wheat and corn farming empires emerge all along the middle border. Now keep in mind that farming in the West was extremely difficult, and a lot of the burden is going to fall on women far more so than men, because remember, women, especially poor women, always worked. They just never got credit for it, right, in the popular mythos. But women were expected to go out and help in the fields and help with the livestock and help on the farms. Here you can see a picture of her gathering chips to burn, right, as firewood. But in addition to that, they are also largely responsible for domestic duties, cooking, cleaning, sewing, childcare. And even today, that's a lot of work, but it was especially a lot of work during this time period. Imagine if you had to clean your entire house without running water or electricity, right? How long that would take just to grab a bucket and walk to the river to get water and come home and light a fire and start the water boiling. So women are going to be working very, very hard. And Western women harder than are going to have it really bad, because even though there were a lot of labor-saving devices that are being invented during this time period, things like, washing machines and vacuum cleaners and that kind of stuff is starting to be invented, farmers in the West aren't going to spend their money on that. They're going to be spending their money on farm machinery, not on labor-saving devices. And guess who's doing the laboring? Women. So this burden is going to fall very, very heavily on women in the West. Now, we will see bonanza farms covering thousands of acres. Bonanza farms are those large agribusiness farms. They're hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of acres. They're owned by a corporation, and they're mass-producing food, just like you would mass-produce anything, right? And they're largely reliant on migrant laborers. That is going to be very, very common in the Trans-Mississippi West. That being said, there still are family farms there. Family farms do dominate this region, but they're under increasing pressure. And the more time goes on, the less family farms there are. So small farmers during this time period do become increasingly oriented to national and international markets. It's no longer going to be just, producing for yourself to eat and maybe trade with your neighbors. They're going to be producing for the market economy. In other words, they're growing stuff not to eat it themselves, but to sell it. And that's something new, right? That's something that begins to happen in the 1840s, 1830s to 1860s in the United States, and by this time it's full on producing for the market. So we begin to see them specializing in a certain crop, depending on where they are. So maybe they only grow wheat, or they only grow corn, or they only grow cotton, or whatever. They're also going to be tied into the national market thanks to, number one, the railroads, right? So they can get stuff in and get stuff out, but also because of mail order catalogs. So there's no Walmart nearby during this time period, but stores like Sears and Roebuck created a mail order catalog where you could look on it and order stuff and have it brought to you. Everything from a new dress to literally a kit to build your own house. So mail order catalogs are going to be tying them into the consumer market. So not only are these producers, but now increasingly they are consumers as well. They're buying stuff as well. A downside of all this is that the farmers are going to be increasingly becoming dependent on loans. In order to compete during this time period, you don't just have to have a farm, which oftentimes means you have a mortgage, but you're going to need to buy farm machinery, tractors and harvesters and everything else that are very, very expensive. And so they become increasingly dependent on loans, and because of increasing globalization, because of things like steam power, for example, they're also having to compete not just with what's grown in the United States, but also what's grown internationally. And so at the same time that their expenses are going up, the money that they can get for their crops is going down. So small farmers during this time period are being increasingly pinched economically. The future of Western farming ultimately is going to lay with giant agricultural enterprises. And this is especially true in California, right? Where you see these giant bonanza farms, and they're going to be relying on migrant laborers, not on families. If you need to pause this recording to catch up on anything, please do so now. When we think of the West, the image that pops into most people's heads, of course, is the cowboy, right? The cowboy then and now was a symbol of a life of freedom on the open range. That, the lone cowboy, he's self-reliant, he goes out and he works hard and does a good job, and he doesn't need any help from anybody. This is the image of the cowboy then and now. In reality, the cowboy was a low-paid waged worker, right? It was far more diverse. Usually we think of them as being white, right? It was far more diverse than that. There were black cowboys, there were Latino cowboys. The commonality that they had was that they were low-paid workers, and they probably worked for a corporation, not for themselves. In fact, Texas cowboys even went on strike in 1883 for higher wages. So this image that we have of the cowboy is largely a myth, right? The cowboy was just like anybody else, a low-paid, low-wage worker. By the mid-1880s, we're going to see cowboys become less and less. And this is going to be because farmers are going to be closing off more and more of the open range and moving cattle operations closer to rail connections. The whole point of the cowboy was to drive cattle, right? And where were you driving the cattle to? You were driving to a railroad, right? Now you can do that if the range is open, because you have to have access to water for the cows. You cannot carry enough water with you for 500 miles to be able to hydrate 300 head of cattle, right? So you can do a cattle drive as long as you have access to water along the way. Before the invention of barbed wire, they did. Nobody fenced off their property. I shouldn't say nobody, almost nobody fenced off their property because it was too expensive, right? But barbed wire was super cheap. You buy this barbed wire, all you need is a stick in the ground, wrap it around, and keep going. And so once barbed wire gets invented in the 1880s, people start closing off their land. And so you can't do a cattle drive. The cows will die. There's no water there. And this is why cattle operations moved closer to the rail line, so you didn't have to do a cattle drive anymore, and that means that the cowboy is going to disappear. We're going to see as well in the West a very, very strong Chinese presence. If you ever watch a Western movie or Western show or read a Western book and there aren't Chinese people running around there, it is completely historically inaccurate because Chinese people are all over the West. Now, initially, this is largely going to be just Chinese men, and they came largely to work on the railroads and in agriculture. But after the Civil War in the 1870s, Chinese immigrants increasingly began to arrive in the West as families. And most of them, about 75% of them, will be settling in California. What this does then is it creates an other, right? Chinese people did not look like the native-born citizens in China. They spoke a different language, they looked differently, their culture was different, their religion was different. And so here became an easily identifiable other that increasingly was competing economically with the native-born people in California, both Latino and non-Latino. And so Chinese immigrants and to a lesser extent Japanese immigrants are going to be facing incredible discrimination on the West Coast. Everything from laws, banning their immigration, denying them citizenship, prohibiting them from owning land. It runs the gamut. Chinese immigrants will work in a variety of Western industries, including mining, agriculture, manufacturing, and especially the railroads. And they did keep in touch with their relatives and events in China through letters and magazines from home. But remember, the longer a group is here, the more assimilated they will become. Another group in the West that was an other are going to be the Mormons. So the Church of Jesus Christ Latter-day Saints, the LDS is the official name of this religion. They're more commonly called Mormons in popular culture, though I know the LDS doesn't particularly like that, so apologies to LDS folk. This is how it is in the book. Anyways, it's an interesting American religion. By many, it is Christian, but many Christians at the time and even today consider it to be heretical. And so it is going to be then and to some degree now highly persecuted. And so in order to escape persecution, in order to practice their religion without interference, in the 1840s, there's going to be a Mormon migration where they migrate to the Great Salt Lake Valley in Utah. And so they're living in Utah for a while, but as more and more Western settlement happens, this is going to erode the isolation that the Mormons enjoyed in Utah. And it's going to lead to violent clashes. Things will come to a head when, before the Civil War, the territorial governor of Utah, Brigham Young, was forcibly removed by President James Buchanan. And James Buchanan sends in federal troops to govern Utah, and they'll be there until the Civil War. And so this is going to usher in a period of tension between Mormon families, between Native Americans, and between new settlers. And this conflict reaches a high point when there's something called the Mountain Meadows Massacre. And this is when Mormons in the area attacked a wagon train of settlers heading to California and are going to massacre over 100 settlers. And only one person was ever convicted of this, even though there was a big group of it. Now, things are going to be kind of tense through the Civil War, but after the Civil War, Mormon leaders are going to try to reduce tensions with the federal government. And so things kind of even out a little bit after that, though things are never going to be completely evened out. Although Mormon leaders, in an effort to kind of smooth things over with the federal government, will be banning the practice of polygamy, for example, in isolated areas, it will persist even to this day. So if you need to pause this recording to catch up on something, please do so now. Western development continues, it is important again to remind you that the West was not empty. People lived there, and the way the West got settled was by taking that land from people who already had it. And so the incorporation of the West into the national economy is going to spell the doom of the Plains Indian and their world. And again, the Plains Indians' demise is largely made possible by the railroad. Before the railroad, there was no reason to go in there because you couldn't get your goods in or out in a cost-effective way. The invention of the railroad changed all that. Now you could get your goods to market. Now you could sell your goods to people who lived in the West. And so the railroad, and especially once they built the transcontinental railroad, is going to be the thing that pushes it over the edge, that is going to be one of the main reasons why the federal government is going to be actively taking this land away. So as settlers encroached on Indian lands, you're going to see bloody conflict between the Army of the United States and Plains tribes. And this begins in the 1850s, and it will continue well into the 1890s. And it's pretty much half a century of constant warfare. At any given point, there's going to be clashes between the Army and Native Americans somewhere. Keep in mind that in the West, in the 18th century, Native Americans had mostly shifted to mounted hunting after the introduction of the horse. And so this idea that they had been living the way they had been living for centuries and centuries isn't true. Native Americans' lifestyles had already undergone fundamental changes, but this is going to change it even more. And so one reason, a second reason why we're going to see Native Americans' demise is because of the buffalo being hunted almost to extinction. In 1800, the buffalo numbered about 30 million. The buffalo were the main staple of their national economy. And due to hunting and army campaigns, they were almost extinct by 1890. In the early 20th century, they decided to do a buffalo nickel, right, where they were going to put the buffalo on a nickel. The artist had to go to the zoo to look at a buffalo to see what they look like. That was really the only place they were. So this process of taking away Native Americans' land, it was not without resistance. Native Americans did fight back. And we certainly can't go through all of them because there was a lot of them. But just to highlight a couple examples, one example was the Nez Perce. They were a tribe that lived in Oregon, and the federal government was, trying to put them onto reservations, and they tried to escape. They were seeking to escape to Canada, and they were pursued by an American general, O.O. Howard, and eventually captured. And in response to this, they were chased for like 1,700 miles before finally surrendering in 1877. And their chief Joseph, talked about freedom, right? This idea of how the United States was denying Native Americans freedom, and he utilized the language of liberty and freedom to condemn confining Indians to reservations. But this is going to fall on deaf ears. Another example is Little Bighorn, right? One of probably the most famous Indian victory, which happens in June of 1876. The Sioux and the Cheyenne were attempting to defend their land from the United States Army led by General George Custer. They will attack Custer at Little Bighorn and defeat him. This attack was led by Chief Sitting Bull and by Crazy Horse. And it was all an attempt to defend their tribal land in the Black Hills of the Dakota Territory. But despite this victory, this was just a delay, right? It was delaying the inevitable. The buffalo were gone. The Native Americans were worn down, right? Remember, there's a lot more people available to fight in the American Army than there are to be warriors of the Cheyenne or the Sioux. And eventually they too, despite this victory, are going to have to surrender and move on to a reservation. So if you need to pause this video to catch up, please do so now. So Indian life, which had already undergone major changes to this point in history, is going to be drastically changed once again. One reason why this is going to happen is because in 1871, Congress will eliminate the treaty system dealing with Native Americans. The treaty system dated back to the Revolutionary era, and this is when the federal government treated Indian tribes like individual nations, and that's why you had treaties. Beginning in 1871, Congress decided that they would not treat Native American tribes as separate nations anymore. And this is largely not anything that's unique to the United States during this time period. This is largely a part of a kind of larger global trend in this idea of the rise of the nation state. This idea that how can you be a nation if you don't have a state attached to it? So this is happening in similar ways in other countries around the world, in Canada, in Australia, for example. But in any event, treaties that were agreed to and had been governing the relationship between the United States and Native Americans are going to be tossed out the window. And instead, the United States is going to create a new bureau called the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And it's going to be this bureau now that is going to be kind of managing federal and Native relations. One policy that the Bureau of Indian Affairs did was it established Indian boarding schools with the intent of, quote, civilizing Native Americans. And oftentimes what this meant was that sometimes forcibly Native American children would be forced to attend these schools where they would not be allowed to speak their native language, they would not be allowed to practice their native crafts or hunt or religions, all with the idea of assimilating them into mainstream white Anglo-Saxon Protestant American society. And the net effect of this was really a cultural genocide. How do you ensure that the Sioux stop being Sioux? Well, don't let their kids learn their language. Don't let their kids learn their culture, their history, their practices. And it was very effective. Not completely effective because these tribes are still around, but they're an echo of what they were, right? So this, you have to kind of ask yourself, is this freedom, right? And freedom for whom? Because for the United States, they would say that they were making Native Americans free by incorporating them into American society, by civilizing them. But Native Americans didn't see it that way. For Native Americans, their ideas of freedom centered on preserving their culture and their political autonomy, as well as controlling their ancestral land. And the United States is not going to recognize that as freedom, at least not freedom worthy of giving to Native Americans. Another crucial step in attacking Native American tribalism will come in 1887 with the passage of the Dawes Act in 1887. The Dawes Act broke up Indian tribal lands into small parcels for farming. And the Indians who accepted the farms and, quote, adopted the habits of civilized life, unquote, would become full-fledged American citizens. The idea of this, again, was assimilating them, right? Making them into small human farmers, just like you see white settlers doing in the West, turning Native Americans into that. And getting rid of this idea of them being something else, right? Kind of blending them in, making them just like, every other American citizen. And the net effect of this was what you'll see as a white settler land rush. And Native Americans, through one way or another, end up losing a lot of their land to these white settlers. So much so that by the time we get to the end of the century, of the 136 million acres of land that Native Americans had possessed in 1887, they will have lost 86 million of those. So most of this land ends up in white hands, and the Dawes Act was an absolute disaster, leading to a loss of tribal land and a major erosion of Indian culture. Now, In the face of all this, some Native Americans sought solace in something they called ghost dances. And the ghost dance was a religious revitalization campaign, and among other things, it foretold the day when the whites would disappear, the buffalo would return, and Native Americans would resume their ancestral customs. Um, and this was very threatening to um, the federal government and to the army. They saw this um, as a precursor to violence, and so there were moves made to clamp down on the ghost dancers, and nothing demonstrates this more than the massacre at Wounded Knee. So, in December of 1890, at Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota, there was some ghost dancers encamped. They were dancing and they were attacked unprovoked by the army. And between 150 and 200 Native Americans, mostly women and children, will be slaughtered by the American government. And sadly, this massacre at the time was widely praised in the press. And, you know, when inquiries were made, the army was whitewashed of all wrongdoing. Some of the soldiers even getting the Medal of Honor for slaughtering these women and children. And really, Wounded Knee is kind of the sad period at the end of this story, right? It marked the end of any meaningful conflict between the native population and European settlers, and kind of puts a sad period on the end of Native American resistance. For a long time, Native Americans were kind of in limbo. They weren't citizens, they weren't not citizens, but they will be finally granted citizenship only in 1924, even though there were some groups that were granted it slightly earlier. If you need to pause this video to catch up on anything, please do so now. The conquest of the American West, again, was part of this global process. This is not something that was unique to the United States during this time period, and American actions were not unique. It kind of calls into question this idea of American exceptionalism. In many ways, we were doing what everybody was doing. So countries like Argentina, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, as well as the United States, are oftentimes called settler societies. And what we mean by settler societies is that immigrants from overseas quickly outnumbered and displaced the original inhabitants of that land. And so in settler societies such as Australia and the United States, Native peoples were usually subjected to cultural reconstruction, getting rid of their culture, taking their land, and forcibly integrating them into the newcomer's society. The other thing we need to keep in mind with the West was that the way we think of it as the Wild Wild West is largely a myth, right? This myth of the West being lawless and wild and moved like cowboys and gunfights largely wasn't true. That's not to say that there weren't places where this was a problem, but that wasn't the norm. Most of the West is going to be highly corporatized early on. It's going to be populated by farms and mines and cities. And so this notion of the West is largely imagined. Everything from the adventure that you would have there to the economic opportunity that was available. And part of this myth is popularized by pop culture. So probably the biggest propagator of this was Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. And it became probably the most important popularizer of this idea, where, you know, Buffalo Bill Cody would go around and you know, put on fake gun battles and have Native Americans dressed in Native garb doing this and doing that. It's also going to be popularized in dime novels, where you have these kind of fictionalized accounts of gunfights and cattle drives and everything else. And so popular entertainment is going to be the thing that imagined the West as a place of adventure and uncorrupted by civilization, and it becomes kind of the staple in Hollywood, where you have Western movies. But the real West was was in some ways more complex and in some ways much more boring, right? It included farm families, it included labor conflict, the federal government kind of propping up everything, right? Building dams and irrigation and railroads. And of course, a lot of racial and ethnic diversity, far more than what people at the time even gave it credit for. So if you need to pause this video to catch up, please do so now. Moving on to the next learning outcome, examine if the Gilded Age political system was effective in meeting its goals. The Gilded Age, if you haven't figured it out by now, was a time of a lot of corruption. In many ways, it's very similar to the first administration of the Trump, or the first administration of the Trump presidency. There's kind of that level of corruption during this time period. And the term Gilded Age was coined by the author Mark Twain, and it was meant to be derogatory. If something is gilded, it means that it looks very shiny, right? Your grandma has gilded stuff all over her house, right? That when you were a little kid, there's that gold, I don't know, knick-knack of a bird, and you thought, oh my God, grandma has a solid gold bird, she must be rich, right? And then you finally got your hands on it and you scratched it and you realize, hey, this isn't gold underneath, there's some kind of crap metal, right? That bird is gilded. On the outside, it looks very shiny, but if you scratch the surface just a little bit, you can see that things underneath are not very nice. And so that's what Mark Twain meant about this time period. And in many ways, it was true, right? You had this conspicuous consumption and super rich people, and the economy is booming. But if you scratch the surface just a little bit, you see that most people are living in poverty. 5-year-olds having to go work in a factory, people freezing to death because they can't afford firewood, right? People getting killed at work and nobody caring. So that very much sums up kind of the Gilded Age. And Americans during the Gilded Age saw their nation as an island of political democracy in a world that was still dominated by undemocratic governments. And in some ways, this was true, and in some ways it's not, right? Because on the one hand, in the United States, white males could vote, whereas in most countries during this time period, there were significant restrictions on the franchise, even for men, right? So on the one hand, if you're going by, who can vote, certainly more people in America could vote than in most places in the world. But keep in mind, there's significant people left out of that, right? Women can't vote, African Americans in many places can't vote, etc. But probably the bigger question you should be asking yourself here then is, what do we mean by democracy, right? If Americans see themselves as an island of political democracy, what do we mean by that? Do we just mean voting, or do we actually mean control of the government by the people, right? That ordinary people's wishes are being expressed by the government. And if that's the case, then we have to say America during the Gilded Age was not very democratic, because most government policies are going to be done at the request or at the behest of the rich and the powerful, right? So political corruption during this time period was rife. We see it in the West. For example, in the West, many railroad lobbyists would be the ones in actual control of legislation. So, state governments are just passing whatever the railroads want them to pass. You see, for example, Western lawmakers holding stock in companies. So, I'm a lawmaker, I pass the laws governing railroads. Oh, and I own a railroad. I wonder what kind of laws I'm going to pass. Are they going to be things that benefit the poor farmers in the area, or is it going to be things that will allow me to charge those poor farmers lots of money so I can get rich, right? So we see that going on in the West. In the cities are rife with corruption. Many of the politics in urban areas fall under the sway of these corrupt political machines. Probably the most famous, though not the only one, was Boss Tweed in New York City. Boss Tweed was a He controlled the Democratic Party there, and the main way he maintained control was by providing help to immigrants. So when immigrants would come, say they got off the boat, right, and they don't speak English, they don't know anybody, they don't have anywhere to live, Boss Tweed would have somebody from, say it was a ship coming from Italy. He would have an Italian person there waiting for the ship, right? And they would see these people, these immigrants coming off, and they would go up to them speaking Italian. Hi, where are you from? Oh, my cousin's from there. Hey, do you have a place to live yet? No? Well, come with me. I have a friend who has an apartment he'll lend to you. Come on. Oh, do you have a job? You don't? Well, you know what? I'll come get you tomorrow. I know a place that's hiring. I'm going to hook you up. And then, he'd check on him. And then election time would roll around, and he would come back and say, how you doing? How's the job? How's the apartment? Great. My friend Boss Tweed is running for election. I need you to vote for him. Will you do it? And of course they would, right? So this is how he was able to maintain control, by providing these services for immigrants. But he did it at a cost, right? Because he did control the city, he's going to bilk New York out of millions, right? So, giving himself a contract, for example, to pick up the trash, and he's going to charge, a gajillion dollars a day to do it, that kind of thing. Eventually he's ousted in the 1870s, but that kind of system was not unique in most big cities during this time period. Laredo famously was controlled by political machines well into the 1970s. And, in the 70s and the 80s, the roads weren't even paved. We somehow couldn't afford it, right? But people like J.C. Martin, who was the mayor, was somehow very rich. So leave it up to you to figure that out. Corruption also existed at the national level. You see this primarily through scandals involving giant corporations. One great example of this is the Credit Mobile scandal in the Grant administration. The Credit Mobile scandal was when there was this corporation that was owned by this inner ring of Union Pacific Railroad stockholders, and they were supposed to oversee the line's government assistant construction. And what they did was they would sign contracts with themselves at kind of these ridiculous profits, and they would protect themselves by distributing stock of this corporation to influential politicians. So politicians wouldn't go after them, wouldn't question, hey, why does it cost 3 times what it should to ship on this line? Because they were getting money too by doing this. So these are examples of the kind of corruption that we see. Politically, during this time period, your book calls it the politics of dead center, right? Because there's really not a big distinction between what the two parties are doing. Republicans are going to largely dominate the presidency from 1868 to 1900. Every Republican candidate for president from 1868 to 1900 had fought in the Union Army. Republicans controlled the North, the Midwest, and the agrarian West. That's where they had their strength. And their coalition consisted primarily of revivalist churches, Protestant immigrants, African Americans, and veterans of the Union Army. And so unsurprisingly, one of the things that Republicans protected was Union soldiers' pension. Union soldiers' pension cost about 40% of the national budget during the time period. Note, not Confederate soldier pension, right? If you were a Confederate soldier, you didn't get one unless you lived in a state that took that on. So Union soldiers' pensions was a thing that they protected. The Democrats are going to dominate the South after 1877. Before that, Republicans controlled that too, but after Reconstruction ends, the Democrats will be dominating the South. And mostly Catholic votes. Catholics tended to vote Democratic, and they lived in cities primarily. Now, the parties were very closely divided, and national elections were actually very, very close. So what that meant was, because elections were so close, that compromise was very necessary during this time period. And so this was an era where, when the government decided to do something, they could actually do it. Compromise was a thing. And it was rare for Gilded Age presidents to try to mobilize public opinion or exert executive leadership. That's not what presidents did during this time period. They, most of this train is going to be driven by Congress. In some ways, American democracy in the Gilded Age seemed remarkably healthy. 80% of eligible voters voted. When you compare that to 58% in 2016 and 36% in 2014, you can see that, at least participation in the bare minimum of voting has really fallen off in today's times. So if you need to pause this video to catch up on something, please do so now. The type of government that existed for a century or so was increasingly finding itself no longer able to deal with the problems created by the economy's rapid growth. In many ways, our politics and our government structure was ill-suited for this shift. Because remember, for a very long time, the country was primarily agrarian and small shop. And then seemingly overnight, it shifted into industrialization, right? So in many ways, the political structure proved ill-equipped to deal with all the problems that are going to emerge from this. And it didn't help that both parties were controlled by politicians with ties to business interests. So instead of helping your ordinary American, politicians during this time period are going to be helping businesses. And businesses very often didn't need help, right? It was unregulated. They could kind of do whatever they wanted. And that is made possible because of governmental policy, because the government actively decided that's what we're going to do. We're going to protect business, not protect individual people. And so in the 1870s, you'll see the tariff policy, for example, being debated by Republicans. Republicans wanted a high tariff to protect industry, even though it hurt agrarian interests. And you'll see in the 1870s Republican priorities taking center stage. Republicans wanted to, for example, pay down the debt, reduce federal spending, and withdraw greenbacks. Greenbacks were the paper money that was circulating during the Civil War, and return to the gold standard in 1879. All of this led to deflation. All of this is going to hurt agricultural areas. All of this is going to hurt workers. And so we will see Republican economic policies strongly favor the interest of Eastern industrialists and bankers. Their policies will be harmful to Southern and Western farmers, harmful to workers, and Republicans are in charge in the 1870s, so we're focusing on them. But keep in mind that Democrats during this time period are largely complicit too, right? They don't, even though nominally they're against some of this, they don't put up much of a fight. They have the tacit acceptance of Democrats too. So if you need to pause this video to catch up on anything, please do so now. Despite this corruption, there were some tepid attempts to reform the system a little bit, to undo some of this corruption, though we won't see it really take off till the Progressive era. One reform we saw was the Civil Service Act of 1883. The Civil Service Act of 1883 is going to create a merit system for federal employees, things like you have to take an exam to get a job, creating a pay scale, right, this kind of stuff. And it was passed after the assassination of President James Garfield. Garfield was assassinated because a supporter wanted a job and he hadn't been given one, and so he was upset. And so that was one of the reasons why, they decided, hey, maybe we should kind of pass a law helping with this. Now, this only applied to 10% of government workers, but it was the start of a professional civil service, because before this, when a new politician took over, he got to appoint people to jobs, and they didn't necessarily have to be qualified, right? It was like, all right, well, we need somebody to run the Library of Congress. Who do we have? I don't know, my cousin needs a job. Can he read? No, but he doesn't need to, does he? Right? Now at least, you would have to meet some minimum qualifications for that. Now, interestingly, the unintended consequence of this was that before this, political parties were largely financed by office holders, right? They would pay so that they would be able to keep their little cushy government job. Now that's illegal. So in some ways, because of this, we're going to see increasingly corporations stepping in to fill the gap. So that was an unintended consequence here. We'll also see Congress establish the Interstate Commerce Commission, the ICC, in 1887. This was a federal agency created to monitor railroad rates, to see how, what the railroads were charging. And this came because the public was very, very angry about railroad price gouging. Remember, if you lived in the West, the railroads were your lifeline. You had to use them. It was your only way in and your only way out. And railroads knew that. And so they charged farmers an arm and a leg. They charged them as much as they could. And so increasingly that was becoming untenable. And so that's what this agency was designed to do. Now, it's important because this is the first federal agency intended to regulate economic activity. And that's huge because before this point, again, it was the Wild West. There was no regulation. There was nobody to tell you you can't do that or you must do that. And so this is huge because this is the first time they're ever going to try to do that. That being said, this is going to lack enforcement power, and it's going to be largely ineffective in actual practice. But as a statement that we are going to start telling private businesses, you can do this, you cannot do that, you must do this, you mustn't do that, it's really, really important. In 1890, the government will also pass something called the Sherman Antitrust Act. This was an attempt to get at those trusts that we talked about, to kind of attack monopolies. And the Sherman Antitrust Act banned practices that restrained free trade. Ironically, most of the time in its early history, the Sherman Antitrust Act was never used against a business. It was used against unions, right? So it's almost impossible to enforce because the language was too vague. So it's not going to be until Theodore Roosevelt that we're actually going to see the government use the Sherman Antitrust Act to go after a company. But they will use it to break up unions. Now, this is important because these acts are going to establish the precedent that the government could regulate the economy and promote the public good. And that's huge, right? The government regulating the economy and promoting the public good was something new, and it's going to be very, very important, especially in the Gilded Age. It's also important to point out that while all this is going on at the national level, there is also conflict going on at the state level. At the state level, you do see this conflict over the proper uses of government authority. And it's still something we haven't quite worked out today, right? What is the government's responsibility toward the public, towards health, towards welfare, towards education? And state governments, especially in the North, during this time period, are going to be expanding their responsibility. And is that a proper use of state power? That's something that was debated during this time period, and even today. While most people, except kind of extreme libertarians, agree that the government has some role to play in protecting and promoting health and welfare, the question still is how much, right? That's still not resolved. Now, you're going to see some states taking the lead on some of these issues, passing 8-hour day laws, helping farmers. And so it's kind of going to be a hodgepodge during this era as to whether or not workers and ordinary people get help at the state level. It won't be until we get to the progressive era where we see this kind of more at a national level. So if you need to stop the video to catch up on something, please do so now. We're now moving into the new learning outcome, analyze how economic development of the Gilded Age affected American freedom. So, as the United States matured into an industrial economy, Americans are going to struggle to make sense of this new social order. And this discussion of the new social order is going to move beyond simply academia, right? It's not going to be something just the elites and the professors are talking about. And it very much filtered down into popular culture. This is stuff people talked about at the bar, at the kitchen table. And, many Americans sensed that something had gone wrong in the nation's social development. Um, and you're going to see this kind of fear of different classes emerge. This idea that, is there class warfare going on? And most Americans, most workers, did feel overworked and did feel exploited, largely because they were, right? And the gap between the rich and poor really did seem to be solidifying during this time period. And you see this reflected in kind of the justifications for this. Because what you begin to see being argued in the Gilded Age was that wages were not supposed to be, quote, fair, but instead should be determined by supply and demand. And that's really new and really different. That's an idea of freedom and equality that the founders of America would not have recognized. So now this new concept of freedom, that it's not about fairness, it's about the market, it's about supply and demand. Now, for the elites, they begin to define freedom as being able to become rich or in reality stay poor. That's what freedom begins to mean for the elites. Can you get rich, right? That's what makes you free. That's not something the founders of the country would have recognized, right? And it's something new during this time period. And so this conversation about wages being fair goes out the window, right? It's all about the market and about getting rich. We also see this being backed up by social Darwinism. Now, the belief that some groups were superior to others, in many ways, is what this nation was founded on. And if you don't believe me, just ask a slave, right? But the difference now in the Gilded Age is that it has, quote, science to back it up, right? Social Darwinism emerged after Charles Darwin published on Origins of Species in 1858. In Origins of Species, Darwin put forth the theory of evolution, whereby plant and animal species best suited to their environment took the place of those less able to adapt. Now, social Darwinism argued that evolution was a natural process in human society, just like it was in nature, and that the government must not interfere, right? So Darwin, for his part, was horrified by this being applied to human societies, right? He absolutely did not want this to happen. But for the social Darwinists, this is what they're arguing, that, people best suited to their environments would thrive, and those that could not would not, and the government should not interfere at all in that. To put it bluntly, if you were rich, it was because you were somehow superior, right? Stronger, faster, smarter, better hair. And if you were poor, it was for one of two reasons. It was either because, number one, you were lazy. You really could have been rich if you worked hard, but you chose not to. Or because, number two, you're somehow inferior. You're dumber, not as fast, have bad hair, whatever. And if that's the case, well, we can't fix stupid, right? So any efforts to lift those at the bottom, such as government regulation of work conditions, requiring a minimum wage, etc., according to social Darwinists, were harmful because it helped the less fit and hurt society. And this is, and so by this way of thinking, failure to advance in society was widely thought to indicate a lack of character. If you're not rich, it's because you're not working hard, you're lazy, something's wrong with you. And in many ways, this is the ideological underpinning of modern-day Republican Party attacks on social programs, right? Why don't Republicans want to spend money on food stamps? Why don't they want to spend money on, health insurance, right? This kind of thing. It traces its ideological history back to social Darwinism, right? And so, um, obviously, there are some major problems with social Darwinism. It's That's not to say that individual choices do not matter, but saying that they are determinative is simplistic and problematic. Just to give you an example, how many of you, your parents work hard? How many of you, your parents are rich, right? So it's certainly not just this: if you work hard, you're going to be rich, and if you don't work hard, you're going to be poor. There's more going on there. But remember, the question you should ask yourself is cui bono: who benefits? Who benefits by this belief? Well, the elites, right? I'm rich because I'm better than you, and I certainly don't need to do anything or treat you well. And you should just probably die, right? That benefits them. And so obviously that's why they're going to be embracing this. So you see this being discussed at the time. The social Darwinist William G. Sumner believed that freedom required a frank acceptance of inequality. And Sumner put forward this duality of choices, right? He said there's only two choices. You can have inequality and freedom, or you could have equality and not liberty, right? That's it. Inequality and freedom, or equality and not liberty. And he argued that the government existed to protect property, quote, the property of men and the honor of women, period. Well, you can decide for yourself whether that should be the only reason why the government exists. But even if you take that aside, right, did he really mean that? Did he really mean all men, right? African American men, for example? The honor of women, really? Did he mean the honor of all women? And interestingly, too, why not the property of women? You see what I'm saying? So even here, cui bono, who benefits by this belief in social Darwinism? If you need to pause this video, please do so now. So the elites in the Gilded Age are going to be pushing forth a negative definition of freedom. And by negative, I don't mean like a good thing or a bad thing. I mean it is a definition of freedom of not doing something, right? A positive definition of freedom, not good or bad, but positive means the government does X, Y, and Z, right? Negative definition of freedom means they do not do X, Y, Z, right? So this is very much a negative definition of freedom, of limited government and unrestrained free market. And attached to that was this idea of the contract. So according to this negative definition of freedom, freedom is limited government and unrestrained free market. That's what freedom means. It means the government is not telling businesses what to do. It's not regulating the market. It's not saying you have to have safe working environments. It's not saying you have to pay your workers. It's not saying you can't dump pollution into the lake, right? It's staying out of all that. Now, keep in mind the kind of double talk here, right? Because at the same time they're doing this negative definition of freedom, they're certainly not saying things like get rid of the tariff, right? Which is government intervention in the economy. They're not saying things like don't give land to the railroad, or don't don't create irrigation projects in the West. They're not saying any of that. They're not saying don't use the army to take land away from Native Americans. So again, cui bono, right? This definition of freedom is meant to benefit the robber barons and the elites, right? And this is not what the founders argued freedom was. So this is a very drastic break in ideology from the revolutionary generation. It is something new. And it's heavily influenced by the ideas of social Darwinism. Now, attached to this is the contract argument. The contract argued that if contracts were freely arrived at by independent individuals, then neither the government nor unions had a right to interfere with working conditions. Right? So if I'm going to work for you and I sign a contract to work for you, then according to this argument, the government and unions can't interfere with that. And furthermore, that if you signed that contract, you couldn't complain about a loss of freedom, right? Now, in reality, this idea, this argument of contract, presupposes that the two parties are equal, right? That they have equal power. The reality, of course, is that they do not. If you need to eat and your children need to eat and there is only one place in town that is hiring, do you really have a choice? Are you really free to decide to work or not work if it means starvation? And the reality is no, right? But this is an idea based on the concept of free labor. And again, they're using this term out of its historical context. Free labor prior to the Civil War meant an independent small producer in a society of broad equality and social harmony, right? That's what it meant then. They're trying to take this term and out of its historical context, right, and put it into the industrialized era, where it is no longer a small independent producer in a society of broad equality, but now an exploited worker working in a sweatshop in unregulated capitalism. But they're going to be using this language as a defense of that, as a defense of unrestrained operations of capitalism. And the courts are largely going to side with them during this time period. The courts in America will typically view state regulation of business as an insult to free labor. And again, it's largely because they are coming at this with the assumption that both parties were on equal footing, when of course they were not. So the courts during this time period generally sided with business enterprises that complained of a loss of economic freedom. That's the phrase that the businesses would use anytime they would be trying to fight regulation, right? This was a loss of economic freedom. And you see this in various court cases. One is the United States versus E.C. Knight Company in 1890. In Knight Company, the Supreme Court ruled that the Sherman Antitrust Act could not be used to break up a sugar refining monopoly because the Constitution empowered Congress to regulate commerce, but not manufacturing, right? It sounds kind of nitpicky, doesn't it? The same standard of neutrality, of course, did not apply to labor unions. Courts will be using the Sherman Antitrust Act to issue injunctions that prohibited strikes, arguing that they interfered with the freedom of trade. And again, this is because the people with money had power, which means that the people with money got to determine what the rules were for everybody else. And of course, they're going to be making rules that benefit them and keep them in power. And the elites and the rich and the powerful are going to be grabbing the language of liberty and using it, defining it in ways that it was never understood before, right? And so if you went against this definition of freedom, right? If you went against this definition of free labor, against this definition of contract, well, then you were un-American, right? And most Americans go along with this because they don't know their history. They don't know that this is new and being invented by the elites at this time period for the benefits of the elites during this time period. They don't know their history. And so how do you fight back if somebody is telling you, no, this is what freedom is, this is what it's always been? How do you know anything different if you aren't educated and don't know your history? Another example of kind of a horrific Supreme Court case during this time period is Knockner versus New York in 1905. This is sometimes called the Dred Scott case for labor, right? That level of badness. And what Lochner did was it voided a state law establishing 10 hours per day or 60 per week as the maximum hours of work for bakers, claiming that it infringed on individual freedom. The problem with this was that, the only time that the court seemed to step in to stop regulation was when it applied to labor unions. It never when it applied to businesses. Courts did everything from protecting yellow dog contracts to striking down laws requiring coal miners to be paid in money and not script. everything they could to benefit business and harm labor. It seems like they did. And John P. Mitchell argued that workers are, quote, being guaranteed the liberties they do not want and denied the liberty that is of real value to them. If you need to pause this video, please do so now. So moving into the new learning outcome, identify how reformers of the Gilded Age approach the problems of an industrial society. So dealing with this labor question then, right, the overwhelming labor question, we see this public debate on the understanding of freedom dividing along class and in many ways racial lines. And so what does freedom mean? Does it mean freedom of contract, right? Does it mean free market and unregulated capitalism? Or does it mean something else? And in many ways, this question over labor is going to take the place of this question over slavery that had existed before the Civil War. It rises to that level of importance. And we see with the 1877 Great Railroad Strike that there was this overwhelming labor question. The Great Railroad Strike was the first national walkout when workers protested a pay cut that paralyzed rail traffic all across the country. They walked out, they refused to work, and basically the railroads ground to a halt. And as you guys know, the railroads super important to the economy during this time period, right? If the railroads aren't working, nothing is working. This is going to crash the economy. And rather than, negotiating with the workers, militia units are going to be sent in by the state to attempt to force them back to work. And troops are going to be firing on strikers. In Pittsburgh, for example, 20 workers will be killed by the militia. And the workers will respond back by rioting, burning city railroad yards to the ground, destroying property. And when it came down to it, the federal government is going to side with the railroad company. They're not going to be trying to work out workers' grievances. Instead, they're going to be using military force to end the strike and to force workers to work under conditions they didn't like, right? So again, it takes us back to that idea of freedom of contract, right? If two groups agree, the government shouldn't interfere. Well, obviously one group was disagreeing and the government's interfering, right? So again, cui bono, right? But what the Great Railroad Strike showed for most Americans during the time was that the Republican Party had stronger ties to industrialists to ordinary workers. That is how most Americans interpreted this, especially after President Hayes ordered the Army to put down the strike by force. Now, following this strike, you're going to see the federal government build armories in major cities all across the country, not to protect the country from invasion, but in order to ensure that troops would be available to quell labor unrest, right? We're building armories in case we need to use the army against workers who don't want to work under certain conditions. And so you have to ask yourself, in the Gilded Age, is this government for the people or government for big business? Who was the government protecting during this time period? Now, in order to kind of fight back against this, again, the main line of defense was going to be labor unions. And one of the most important labor unions early on is going to be called the Knights of Labor. In the 1880s, the Knights of Labor organized all workers to improve social conditions. And it was led by Terence V. Powderly. And the Knights of Labor talked about conditions essential to liberty, is what they said. In other words, what does it mean to be free, right? Are we creating conditions in this country where people are actually free? And so the Knights of Labor were unique in that they tried to organize both unskilled and skilled workers, women, as well as African Americans. Later labor unions are going to be excluding unskilled workers, they'll be excluding women, they'll be excluding African Americans. So the Knights of Labor were radical for their time period in doing that. Their demands included such radical things as the 8-hour workday, as well as public employment in economic downturns. And this raised the question of whether meaningful freedom could exist in a situation of extreme economic inequality. If you have to work in conditions where you have to work 14 hours a day in dangerous conditions, breathing stuff that's going to give you lung cancer, and if you don't do that, your children are going to starve, are you actually free, right? This is the kind of question that they're asking. If you need to pause this video, please do so now. So as you can tell, there are a lot of problems in the Gilded Age. And the middle class especially is going to be quite concerned by this. The middle class is largely the bulwark of stability in most societies. The middle class tends to like what they have, so they don't want to rock the boat. So that's why the middle class is so important. It keeps your country kind of stable. And during this time period, increasingly, we're going to see the middle class alarmed by fears of class warfare, as well as the growing power of concentrated capital. They're kind of alarmed at both ends. The fact that these rich men like Carnegie and Rockefeller, are basically unaccountable, as well as the fact that you have poor workers rioting and burning the place down in, Philadelphia. And so you're going to see a number of social thinkers emerge offering numerous plans for change. And there's going to be lots of books that promise, kind of optimistic remedies for the unequal distribution of wealth. And all of them are kind of going to be seeking to reclaim this imagined golden age of social harmony and American freedom, right? And of course, this never existed. There was never a time when, everybody sang Kumbaya and everybody was equal and happy. But I guess reality doesn't matter, right? We can pretend there was, and they're going to try to get there. And so there's a lot of them during this time period, but just to give a few examples, one guy is Henry George. Henry George wrote a book called Progress and Poverty in 1879, and he offered the solution of a, quote, single tax, which would replace all the other taxes in society. And it would be a levy on increases in the value of real estate. And so this was a way to try to get at a graduated income tax, right? Having the rich pay more in taxes than the poor to try to lessen that income inequality. Of more importance was the popularization of the idea that the old world social distress had found its way to America, right? That the problems of Europe had somehow crept into us. And Henry George's work kind of talks about that and is looking to fix that. And so that's important because, remember, Americans viewed themselves as this kind of exceptional place, this island of freedom and democracy surrounded by bad places, right? And George is arguing, no, all that's here too, right? And so this is an attempt to kind of undo that. Another example of ideas is Lawrence Grunland's. He wrote a book called Cooperative Commonwealth in 1884, and this was the first book to popularize socialist ideas for an American audience. So Grunland was a lawyer from Denmark, and he believed that socialism, well, let me back up. Socialism is the belief that private control of economic enterprises should be replaced by government ownership in order to ensure a fairer distribution of the benefits of the wealth produced. In other words, the government would control the means of production and not an individual. And there's different levels of socialism. Keep this in mind, right? So to put it simply, who owns the factory? In capitalism, a person owns the factory. Carnegie owns the factory. Under socialism, the government would own the factory. And so instead of Carnegie getting all the money, the government gets all the money, and it can spend it on wages, it can spend it on healthcare, it can spend it on schools, this kind of thing. And this is very common throughout the world. The United States is, and even in the United States, there is some socialism. For example, in Laredo, we pay our water bill to the city of Laredo. The city owns the water company. The city owns the means of production, right? So most countries have mixed economies. They have some capitalism and some socialism. The United States is more capitalist than socialist, but it's a mixed economy. There is some socialism here. And even, countries that are, quote, socialist aren't all equal. There's different levels, right? There's the United States, which is very, very low. There's kind of medium, where the government controls just a few industries, certain industries, right? Like, for example, in England, the government controls the healthcare industry. But hey, you can still be super rich in England. You can still own a business. You can still become a millionaire. They have a queen, for goodness sakes, right? And then there's like extreme, communism, where the government owns all the means of production. Think about like North Korea, right? Most places somewhere in between North Korea and America, right? Where usually the government owns certain industries. So again, the idea of this is to ensure a fairer distribution of wealth, to make sure that everybody is kind of benefiting more equally. And so Groland portrayed socialism as the end result of peaceful evolution, right? And this was in contrast to Marx. Marx, when he puts forth his idea, is specifically saying this has to be a violent revolution, right, in the Communist Manifesto. Groland's saying, no, this is just going to be a peaceful evolution. And that made it very acceptable to Americans. And so you're going to see socialism during this time period gaining more and more adherents. And finally, of course, we have Edward Bellamy. Edward Bellamy wrote a book called Looking Backward in 1888. And in it, Bellamy argued that freedom was a social condition resting on interdependence, not on autonomy. In other words, the opposite of what social Darwinists would argue, right? Social Darwinists argue, I did it all by myself, autonomous, pulled myself up on my bootstraps, nobody helped me. Bellamy says, no. Freedom is when we are working together, when we're helping each other. That's what it means. And so really this is promoting socialist ideas without calling it socialism. Nevertheless, it's going to inspire the creation of hundreds of nationalist clubs, all trying to bring about this vision of the year 2000 portrayed in his book. I hate to tell him 2000 didn't look the way he thought it would. So if you need to pause this video, please do so now. Another strain of reformers that we'll see during this time period are Protestant reformers. You will see what was called a Christian lobby of mainstream Protestants seeking political answers to the moral dilemmas that they observed as a result of labor strife and organization, as well as threats to religious faith by Darwinism and science. So in some ways this is like, progressive, and in some ways it's not. In some of the problems that they saw with industrialization, things like, alcoholism, things like, prostitution, they wanted to help. But they also are going to be very anti-science, for example. This was very much mainstream Protestantism, so it's not Catholic typically during this time period. It's not, Latter-day Saints. And they very much wanted federal legislation that would, quote, Christianize the government, quote, by outlawing sinful behavior. And so they are not adhering very much to that, separation of church and state, right? They very much want the government to outlaw what they considered sinful behavior. You see this with groups like the Women Christians Temperance Union. The Women's Christian Temperance Union is really important and is bouncing all around in this part. This is kind of the women's arm of this movement, the Women's Christian Temperance Movement, and others. And they will be moving away from what was called moral suasion, right, to campaign for federal legislation outlawing the consumption of alcohol, for example. In other words, they're moving away from telling you this is bad to forcing you to stop, right, with the arm of the federal government. And so a lot of the stuff that they're going to be focusing on include things like ending prostitution, ending gambling, prohibiting birth control, and prohibiting polygamy. All of these were behaviors that moral reformers are going to be targeting during this time period. And note that particularly birth control, this has a lot to do with controlling the behavior of women, right? This has a lot to do with sustaining patriarchy. Protestants of this new, quote, Bible Belt will be joining the campaign for federal regulation of individual morality, and this is breaking with white Southern states' rights tradition. Typically, the Bible Belt is, going through the South. If you listen to, the myth of the lost cause, for example, Southerners argued that, the Civil War was trying to keep the federal government from interfering in ordinary people's lives. The Bible Belt kind of ignores that and has no problem using the federal government to end behaviors that they did not like. You see an example of this with the Mann Act of 1910. This was an act that banned the transportation of women across state lines for, quote, immoral purposes, right? And it's interesting because most Protestants concentrated on individual sins, but saw nothing immoral about the kind of unregulated pursuit of wealth, right? If you are familiar with the teachings of, say, Jesus Christ, he was very kind of adamant about how bad, unrestrained pursuit of wealth was, right? There's that famous quote about it's impossible basically for a rich person to get into heaven, that kind of thing. So again, a lot of this has to do with maintaining patriarchy, as well as kind of ending behaviors that they don't like. We also see the social gospel during this time period. One of the main leaders of this is Walter Rauschenbusch. He was a Baptist minister from New York, and he insisted that freedom and spiritual self-development required an equalization of wealth and power. That freedom and spiritual self-development required an equalization of wealth and power, and that unbridled competition really mocked the idea of Christian brotherhood. And so social gospel adherents would establish missions and establish relief programs in urban areas. So they would go into the slums, and they would be attempting to alleviate poverty. Combat child labor, try to, get better housing, better wages, better working conditions. And you're also going to see some leaders in American Catholicism also attempt to alter the church's traditional hostility towards movements for social reforms and support labor movements, right? In the effort to kind of uplift the underclass. If you need to pause this video, you may do so now. The final event we want to talk about in this lecture is the Haymarket affair. So this is going to be a major riot that essentially is going to be the end of the Knights of Labor and leads to kind of a major blow against organized labor. So here's what happened. On May 1st, 1886, some 350,000 workers in cities all across the country demonstrated for an 8-hour day. And this is what May Day is, by the way, what the holiday May Day is, celebrated around the world. It's a holiday for organized labor. So remember, before this time period, most people worked like 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. So the 8-hour day was, you work 8 hours, 40 hours a week. So if you enjoy your weekend, say thank you to the labor movement. So while this is happening, in Chicago, a couple days later, the strikes, there's demonstrations continuing, and there was a strike by workers who work for McCormick. And on May 3rd, 4 strikers are going to be killed by police. So the next day, on May 4th, there's this riot that's held in Haymarket Square to protest these killings. And while they're at the Haymarket Square on May 4th, somebody is going to throw a bomb, and the bomb is going to explode, and a policeman is killed, and a riot breaks out, right? People are scared, police are opening fire. Now, To this day, we don't know who threw the bomb, but soon after, the police are going to use this event as an excuse to raid offices of labor and radical groups and arrest their leaders. And you have to ask yourself, who do you think the police are working for, right? Who do you think is controlling the police departments in these cities? Are they working for the people, or do you think that maybe the owner of McCormick Harvester Company might have a hand in all this? In any event, employers are going to take this opportunity to paint the labor movement as dangerous, to paint it as un-American, as prone to violence, as controlled by foreign-born radicals, right? Xenophobia and nativism playing a big role here. Eventually, 8 anarchists were charged with plotting and carrying out the bombing, and not by accident, 7 of the 8 men accused of plotting this were foreign-born, right? So they are the other. Despite weak evidence, 4 of them will be hanged, 1 committed suicide, and 3 were imprisoned until their sentences were commuted in 1893. The Haymarket Square riot would serve as the death knell for the Knights of Labor, and it helped to demonize union membership in the eyes of many of the middle-class American public. And so, that being said, that doesn't mean labor goes away, right? You see labor taking a stab at politics. Probably the most prominent person to do this was Henry George, who ran for mayor of New York in 1886 on a labor ticket. So there was some belief that, hey, with the election of Henry George, maybe labor might be on the verge of establishing itself as a permanent political force. But Haymarket Square kind of undid that, right? And labor largely will go on the defense, for about a century. And this concludes this lecture.